9:40 a.m., March the 3rd, 1991. After a short 17-minute trip from Denver, United Airlines Flight 585 is on final approach into Colorado Springs. It looks like a perfect day for flying, but there's trouble in the air.
Nice looking day. Hard to believe the skies are unfriendly.
There's been heavy turbulence during the flight, and violent gusts of wind are forecast over Colorado Springs.
Never driven to Colorado Springs and not gotten sick.
At the controls is 52-year-old Captain Harold Green, a pilot with 20 years' experience and a sterling reputation. Green's co-pilot is Patricia Eidson. At 42, she's one of the first female flight officers in United's history.
Flight attendants, prepare for landing.
At Colorado Springs Municipal Airport, Air Traffic Controller James Rayfield is ready to bring Flight 585 in.
United 585, report the airport in sight.
Got it?
Yep.
Airport in sight, United 585.
Lower landing gear.
United 585 is cleared for a visual approach to runway 35. Weather conditions, wind 320 degrees at 16, gusting at 29.
As its speed decreases, Flight 585 becomes more vulnerable to the turbulence. Eidson wants to know what other planes have experienced on landing.
Any reports lately of any loss or gain of airspeed?
Yes, ma'am. 500 feet, a 50-knot loss. At 400 feet, a 50-knot gain. And at 150 feet, a gain of 20 knots.
Sounds adventurous, thank you.
Starting on down.
Less than 3 kilometers from the airport, retired policeman Harold Darnell is on his way to a local flea market. A kilometer overhead, Green and Eidson focus on keeping their speed constant as they descend.
Wait, a 10-knot change here.
Yeah, I know. Awful lot of power to hold that airspeed.
As United 585 approaches the runway, Darnell feels something strange.
Oh, what the heck was that?
Out of nowhere, a powerful gust of wind strikes his vehicle, almost blowing him off the road.
Another 10-knot gain.
3 flaps.
From the control tower, James Rayfield can now see Flight 585's final approach. As the aircraft closes in on the airport, the ride gets even bumpier.
Wow. We're at 1,000 feet.
Then, without warning, the 737 starts to spin out of control.
Oh, God's sake! 15 flaps! 15!
Going up.
Oh, my God!
Oh, my Lord. Crash! Crash!
Rescue workers arrive within minutes, but there's almost no sign of the 737. The shattered remains of the 38-ton jet lie buried in a fire-blackened impact crater.
The plane didn't skate or bounce, you know, like when a plane comes in normally and lands. It just nosed right in, and where it hits, where it stayed.
And I came down here, and this is when I saw all of the, it was horrible.
There are no survivors. All 20 passengers and 5 crew members are killed instantly by the high-speed impact and exploding jet fuel. In 10 violent seconds, Colorado Springs has become the site of one of the most mysterious air crashes in aviation history. By nightfall, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board descend on Colorado Springs. Known to insiders as tin kickers, NTSB investigators examine over 2,000 aviation accidents a year, at times by picking through the metal debris of fallen aircraft. While coroners mark the location of human remains in red, NTSB investigators mark scraps of metal in yellow, looking for clues to help them solve the mystery of Flight 585. Like investigating a mass murder, it's a tough job walking onto a crash site. Among the investigators assigned to the case is Malcolm Brenner, a specialist in human performance. His job will be to find out if the crash was caused by pilot error.
The area was cordoned off by police, and there were Salvation Army trucks. I got a cup of coffee, a cup of hot chocolate or something, and I thanked them for it, and they said, "No, no, thank you." And they had this look in their eyes like, "My God, you have to go into this site."
Clues to the fate of United 585 lie mangled in a deep black hole. The fuselage is crushed like an accordion in the impact crater. The rest of the plane is in pieces spread over an area smaller than a football field.
There was a lot of fire damage. There'd been a fire afterwards, and it was all contained in a relatively small area, which just initial impression, it can be a sign that the airplane was intact. If there was a mid-air explosion or something came off the airplane, you'd expect that to be a much larger site.
My first sense that it was going to take some time to investigate the accident was the damage that we saw in the parts. When they're burnt and broken, the process always takes longer.
But with their work just beginning, members of the NTSB have no clue that the case of United 585 will become the longest crash investigation in aviation history. A clear late winter day in 1991 turned deadly in just 10 short seconds. Moments from landing in Colorado Springs, United Airlines Flight 585 fell out of the sky at 370 kilometers per hour.
Crash! Crash!
All 20 passengers and 5 crew members died. The National Transportation Safety Board begins a painstaking investigation into the crash. Engine turbines, hydraulic pressure gauges, the cockpit voice recorder, and in-flight data recorder are all carefully extracted from the site, photographed, and sent to the lab for analysis. An important first step in the investigation is the analysis of the cockpit voice recorder. With pilot error a factor in 70% of air disasters, Malcolm Brenner's job is to see what role pilots Green and Eidson played in the crash.
This crew was, and I felt this at the time, was one of the more impressive crews that I'd ever dealt with. There was a little bit of tension release, a little bit of humor. The captain said,
"Never driven to Colorado Springs and not gotten sick?"
The first officer suggested that they add extra speed as a safety margin. The captain agreed with it. It was good interaction.
Got it?
Yep.
Airport in sight, United 585.
Lower landing gear.
This is a sense of an excellent crew. caught randomly, if anything. So again, that was my first impression, is that this would be consistent more with a hardware situation.
As more about Flight 585 becomes known, mechanical failure becomes a serious suspect. Just seconds before it crashed, the plane rolled onto its back and spun wildly out of control. Investigators wonder if the sudden motion was caused by the plane losing an engine or a wing. From the state of the aircraft on site, it's clear that it was intact at the time of the crash. What investigators don't know is if the engines were still working at impact. Technicians examine the engine turbines. They discover dirt has been drawn deeply into every crevice. These blades were clearly spinning and sucking in air at the time of impact. The engines may have been running, but technicians aren't sure how well. The plane's hydraulic pressure dials are destroyed, their glass covers broken. The indicator needles have been snapped off by the force of the impact, but even these ravaged dials tell a tale.
15 flaps! 15!
On close inspection, investigators find a critical mark. At the moment of impact, a dent was made on the faceplate by the jarred indicator needle. It proves that when United 585 crashed, its engines were running normally. With engine failure ruled out, there seems to be only one other mechanical explanation for why 585 suddenly rolled over and then fell out of the sky. It appears increasingly likely that the plane had suffered a catastrophic problem with its flight controls. Investigators quickly become suspicious of the rudder at the back of the tail.
We focused in after eliminating other flight control surfaces that we thought could contribute to the roll. We started looking at the rudder.
Bring that up so I can take a look at it.
Investigators begin their examination of the rudder on site, but the violence of the crash makes the job extremely difficult.
Almost nothing left.
Most of the plane's parts are too crushed or burned for testing, but a vital component is still reasonably intact: the Power Control Unit, or PCU. Used constantly during flight, especially during landings, the PCU performs like a car's power steering. When the pilot pushes on a rudder pedal, the PCU uses hydraulic fluid to convert gentle movements of a pilot's foot into the pressure needed to move the 737's enormous rudder. The heart of the PCU is something called the dual servo valve. Shaped like a soda can, it has two slides which glide past one another, directing the flow of pressurized hydraulic fluid that moves the rudder.
This servo valve is very unique, that it is, in effect, two valves in one, and that creates a whole range of interactions that don't occur in a more conventional hydraulic valve.
When a technician opens the power control unit, chips of metal are found floating in the hydraulic fluid. It's a disturbing find. These particles could cause the servo valve to jam, making it impossible to work the plane's rudder. It's a chilling prospect. Could a microscopic fault bring down a 38-ton jet? It's difficult for Phillips to tell. While more intact than much of the wreck, the PCU and dual servo valve are both damaged.
The airplane crashed and burnt in a pretty confined area, and there was a lot of damage to the flight control components and the things we were testing and needed to test and look at. The more damaged the components are, the harder it is to take measurements and do functional testing.
To test what he does have, Phillips travels to California, to the labs of Parker Hannifin, where the rudder control unit is made. The curious metal chips floating in the PCU's chambers are dismissed. Phillips is told that filters keep them out of the delicate servo valve that directs fluid and moves the rudder. Nothing else is found that could explain any sudden movement of the rudder on Flight 585.
We didn't have any absolute indication or information that we could point to that said the rudder power control unit, the servo valve, or any part of that flight control system caused that accident.
Phillips still suspects a mechanical problem, but with no conclusive evidence that the PCU or servo valve caused the crash, he's forced to sign off on the tests.
It's a pass.
With Phillips at a dead end, only bad mountain weather remains as a primary suspect. An expert on weather-related aviation accidents, Greg Salatolo is trying to determine if heavy winds on the day of the crash were a factor.
There is a history of events where there have been airplane accidents attributed to mountain waves or rotors. In 1966, a BOAC 707 near Mount Fuji disintegrated in a mountain wave and rotor.
High winds crashing over mountain peaks leave so-called wind rotors in the lee side. Invisible, highly turbulent downdrafts that come plunging down with devastating power and are extremely dangerous to aircraft.
We found a great deal of evidence looking at the surface upper air data and talking to witnesses in the area that rotors were a possibility.
An explosion, it was right over there.
Salatolo hears several eyewitness reports of bizarre mountain weather on the day of the crash. One of the most intriguing is from Harold Darnell.
Oh, what the heck was that?
Whose truck was struck by a powerful gust of wind just moments before 585 crashed. But as Greg Salatolo combs through his evidence, the theory that a wind rotor knocked the plane from the sky is getting less and less likely.
Nice looking day. Hard to believe the skies are unfriendly.
Wind rotors are areas of extremely low barometric pressure. So if Flight 585 did pass through one, its altimeter reading would have spiked as the plane was blown suddenly upwards.
There was no evidence that we saw that on the flight data recorder of 585.
What the flight recorder did show was a fast and deadly drop in altitude as the plane fell to Earth. It's been 21 months since the investigation into the crash of United Flight 585 began. Almost 2 years in which the NTSB has studied the crew, the weather, the rudder, and thousands of other pieces of evidence. They've come up empty-handed. For only the 4th time in its history, the NTSB releases a report which doesn't reach a conclusion. The cause of the crash of Flight 585 is undetermined.
We had put a lot of time and effort into the investigation, and we just weren't sure what had happened.
It was like he was tracking a serial killer. He was frustrated that they had not solved 585. He did not want that to happen again.
But almost 2 years after the report on 585 is released, the killer strikes again. At 7 p.m. on a clear, windless day, US Air Flight 427 is nearing Pittsburgh. Captain Peter Germano and First Officer Chuck Emmett are getting ready for their final approach.
Folks, from the flight deck, we should be on the ground about 10 more minutes. Sunny skies, a little hazy. Flight attendants, please prepare for landing. I ask you to check the security of your seatbelt. Thank you.
US Air 309, descend and maintain 6,000.
As they close in on the airport, the pilots are on the lookout for another flight about 10 kilometers ahead of them.
Looking for the traffic. Turning 100, US Air 427.
I see the jet stream.
As they pass through the turbulence left behind by the other flight, their jet suddenly and alarmingly rolls left.
Hold on, hold on. Hold on. Shoot!
Nothing the pilots do seems to have any effect.
What the hell is this? What the? Go! Shoot! God. Oh, God. 427, emergency! Oh, shoot. Oh! Oh, God! Oh, God, no!
Rescue crews arrive quickly, but the fate of Flight 427 is tragically clear. There's no hope for the 132 passengers and crew. The human carnage is so bad, authorities declare the crash site a biohazard.
US Air 427 accident was the first US accident where biohazard suits were used, and it made it more difficult. They were uncomfortable, they were hot, and to this day, when I put on a pair of rubber gloves, for any reason, I'm instantly transformed back to the site in Pittsburgh.
Captain John Cox, a 737 pilot and a flight systems specialist with the Airline Pilots Association, is asked to join the team investigating the crash of Flight 427. As coroners attempt to collect human remains, NTSB lead investigator Tom Houter already knows his hunt for clues will be long and painstaking.
When we first arrived at the crash site, well, first of all, there was no aircraft there. There were only bits and pieces of the airplane. It wasn't really recognizable as an airplane.
With the help of eyewitnesses, information from the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, investigators begin to quickly see some striking similarities between 427 and the unsolved case of United 585. In fact, they seem to be mirror images of each other. On final approach, United 585 rolls right, while US Air 427 rolls to the left.
Oh, God, flip! Hang on, hang on.
Both crews are caught by surprise, and after just a few terrifying seconds, both aircraft plummet straight into the ground.
Certainly the whole team was aware of the previous accident with United 585 in Colorado Springs. We try to keep that in the back of our minds and take a look at this one as to what it presents to us.
As the investigation continues, the list of similarities grows. 427's engines were also attached and functioning at the time of impact. But for all the similarities, there's one important difference. Unlike United 585, as US Air 427 approached Pittsburgh, weather conditions were dead calm.
Folks from the flight deck, we should be on the ground about 10 more minutes. Sunny skies, a little hazy.
Taking a look at the flight data recorder information, the aircraft's approaching Pittsburgh. It's an extremely smooth night. There's just no turbulence at all. The pilots are relaxed. They're talking about the landing.
Flight attendants, please prepare for landing. I ask you to check the security of your seatbelts. Thank you.
As he did in the case of United 585, Greg Phillips will once again lead the investigation into the mechanical aspects of the crash. Almost immediately, he makes a promising discovery. Miraculously, much of US Air 427's tail and rudder appear intact. The hydraulic devices inside the tail have also sustained very little damage. Phillips and Houter prepare to send the parts to the manufacturer, Parker Hannafin, for testing as soon as possible. They need answers. Pressure on the NTSB to solve the accident is growing quickly. Not only are the crashes of flights 585 and 427 disturbingly similar, both of them involve the same kind of airplane, a Boeing 737. But with serious questions being raised about the plane's safety, billions of dollars, and perhaps the airline industry itself, are at risk.
We couldn't live with the fact as investigators of having 2 unsolved 737 accidents. The airplane is in too much use, too wide a use around the world. It carries too many people every day. Unsolved was not an acceptable answer.
If 427 was an undetermined accident, we could not find the cause of this accident, there was a great chance that if there was a third accident with the 737 fleet under similar circumstances, that the 737 fleet would have been grounded.
Careful with it.
The investigation into the crash of Flight 427 may be the most important in the history of the NTSB. But it won't be easy. Answers are still years away. In just 3 years, 2 Boeing 737s have crashed in the United States with no survivors.
Site United 585.
In both cases, the planes were moments from landing.
Flight attendants, please prepare for landing.
And in both cases, the planes were under full power, but the pilots were unable to control their jets. In the crash of United Flight 585, NTSB investigators were unable to find a cause. Now they're searching for clues into the second crash, US Air Flight 427.
As the investigator in charge, I never allowed myself to think this investigation could go undetermined. We kept on pushing and kept on researching. As long as we had things to research, we kept on going.
To find their killer, the NTSB can't afford to rule anything out. From the possibility that a collision with birds brought 427 down, to strange, even bizarre theories.
They looked at electromagnetic interference. They got calls from people saying it might be Russian death rays. They considered everything.
There were a couple of witnesses who gave reports of the aircraft suddenly descending and hovering before it blew up. We discounted those.
But the investigation's primary suspect is the dual servo valve, part of the power control unit that moves the 737's rudder, and a suspect in the crash of United 585. Parker Hannafin made the valve. At its lab in California, investigators look inside the main cavity of the US Air Power Control Unit. Just like in the earlier crash, they find tiny chips of metal floating in the hydraulic fluid. But once again, Parker and Boeing repeat their claim. Filters designed to stop any debris from interfering with the delicate metal slides have done their job. Investigator Greg Phillips wants to be absolutely sure. If the chips were blocking the slides, they would have left tiny scratch marks behind where they rubbed against the metal. But Phillips can't find any.
Another pass. Okay.
Phillips has technicians put the servo valve from Flight 427 through as many tests as he can think of, trying to find a weakness. If he can find one, it could explain why 2 planes were ripped from the sky. But he comes up empty.
That unit passed all its operational tests. There wasn't any indication that it had failed, and it operated within the parameters we expected it to.
Once again, the investigators are forced to shift their focus back to the pilots. By studying the plane's flight data recorder, investigators know that the jet's rudder was deployed fully to one side, what's called rudder hardover.
We were definitely focused on rudder, on hardover rudder, full rudder input for about 20 seconds. It can be caused either by hardware, something unknown in the hardware, or it can be caused by pilot input.
First Officer Chuck Emmett, who was flying 427, did indeed step down hard on his rudder and then held it there while the plane plummeted towards the Earth. It raised a grisly question. Was he trying to fly the plane into the ground?
And looking at this, and being a pilot myself, is like, this doesn't seem like rational behavior.
What the hell is this?
Human performance specialist Malcolm Brenner listens closely for evidence on the cockpit voice recorder.
What the hell? Shoot!
In this case, they had microphones right by their mouths, and you can hear as well as in real life or better. You can hear breathing sounds.
Yeah, I see the jet stream.
The cockpit recordings indicate that Flight 427's troubles began at the moment it flew through the jet wake of a Delta Airlines 727 that had just passed in front of them.
Both pilots are startled by the wake.
I see the jet stream.
The first officer breaks off at the end of a sentence. I see the jet stream, and there's no more discussion of the jet stream or anything else. They both focus. Something happened here. Captain says, "Sheesh."
It was such a smooth flight that it was a momentary jolt that they just hadn't anticipated. And with that, the pilots got on the controls and immediately, put in a rudder input.
The cockpit recorder even records the thumping sound of the jet stream turbulence as 427 flies through it. As Flight 427 encounters the turbulence, Brenner hears something unusual. First Officer Emmett begins to grunt.
The grunting is unusual. The controls are designed so that pilots don't need to grunt. They're specially designed around human capabilities. So to have someone grunting is typically a sign of an emergency.
By matching data from the flight recorder with the crew's voices, Brenner is able to confirm that Emmett's grunts begin a split second after he pushed down on the rudder pedal, and 3 to 4 seconds after the wake turbulence affected Flight 427.
What the hell?
On their own, the cockpit voice recordings prove very little. But it seems clear that the crew weren't trying to crash their plane. Something happened which took them by surprise. They reacted as quickly as they could, but nothing they did seemed to help.
What the hell is this?
It's been almost 2 years since the crash of Flight 427, and the investigation has stalled. Now 2 737s have gone down in startlingly similar ways, and investigators still don't know why.
We were all frustrated as months wore into years. What were we missing?
It definitely took a toll in their personal lives. They worked incredibly long hours. They never stopped thinking about it.
We were going up against an aircraft that had an incredible safety history. It was really everything you could see for 30 years. This has been a great airplane. We were trying to prove that there was something wrong with the straight A student.
It clearly was on his mind. He, at one point, had a nightmare about it where he dreamed that he was in front of a congressional committee that was grilling him on now there had been a third 737 crash, and in Tom's dream, all of the cameras were pointing to him, and a congressman asked, "Why didn't you ground the fleet?"
Unsure of where to look next, and with the trail of evidence getting colder, investigators need a break in the case, and fast.
East wing 517, you're clear for landing.
On June the 9th, 1996, they finally get the break they've been looking for. Captain Brian Bishop is on final approach to Richmond, Virginia, when, without warning, his east wind jet rolls sharply to the right.
We didn't know to what extent, but we knew we had a problem with the rudder. I turned the yoke the opposite direction and stood on the opposite rudder pedal. The pedal didn't move for me.
For over 30 seconds, the 737 flies in a precarious right bank as Bishop fights to keep it from rolling over. Then suddenly, the unknown forces holding the jet let go, snapping the wings back to horizontal.
In a matter of seconds, it released itself and went back to normal. We had started the checklist. Almost before I could finish the sentence, all of a sudden there was just a wham.
For a second time, the 737 is pushed onto its side. For 30 harrowing seconds, the 737 takes on a life of its own. Then, once again, as quickly as it began, the rollover stops.
After the second time, I looked at the first officer and I said, declare an emergency.
Tell the controller we have flight control problems.
As they slow down to land, the risks increase. If a third rollover occurs, they won't have enough airspeed to recover.
I did at some point tell my first officer to look out the window and find a dark spot. It was nighttime and we were looking to avoid a neighborhood or a populated area. And he very calmly responded that, hey, here's a spot over here.
But there is no third rollover. Bishop brings Flight 517 in high and fast and lands safely.
Taxiing in is when I realized my legs were shaking. We got the aircraft to the gate, and I did pick up the PA to make an announcement to try to explain what had just happened to these people. And on picking up their microphone, I realized there was nothing I could say to make this any better. And probably for the first time in a long time, I was at a loss of words. So I simply put the microphone down and let it go at that.
But Bishop won't remain speechless for long. By the next day, the investigation team has arrived in Richmond.
Flight data recorded was undamaged, an airplane undamaged. We launched to the scene. The airplane literally didn't move, stayed at its location, the airport, until we got down there.
There were a lot of FAA, a lot of NTSB, and they all wanted to talk to us very badly.
It gave the NTSB a tremendous break because suddenly they had a 737 that had had a rudder incident that was intact, and they had a pilot who was alive and who could talk about it.
I think they were much happier to have the airplane than me. I think the airplane probably gave them more to research than I ever could.
NTSB investigators quickly determined that what happened on board Eastwind Flight 517 is alarmingly similar to events on Flights 427 and 585. If they can discover why Bishop's 737 rolled over, they may be able to crack two mysterious and fatal accidents.
And when we said, well, what happened? They said, there was something wrong with the rudder pedal. The pedal wouldn't go down. I was standing on the rudder pedal and I couldn't get it to go down. My God.
With Bishop's first-person testimony, investigators immediately zero in on Eastwind's rudder controls. The power control unit is removed, inspected, and then tested again and again. To the frustration of everyone, the unit performs perfectly.
We tested that aircraft as is. It was intact. We went through it completely. We did flight tests with it, and it passed all tests.
After a 5-year hunt for clues, a third mysterious rudder event on a 737, and a live pilot as a witness, Tom Houter still lacks the evidence he needs to crack his case. He decides to push his chief suspect, Flight 427's rudder controls, a little harder.
One fellow mentioned a test they had done in the military of a thermal shock, where if you had the actuator being very cold and put in very hot hydraulic fluid, it would cause it to react in strange ways. So we put together a thermal shock test. And this test was extreme, to say the least.
On August the 26th, 1996, in Valencia, California, NTSB investigators gather to watch the torture test of US Air 427's PCU. After soaking it in dry ice, the PCU is blasted with nitrogen gas to simulate the minus 40-degree temperatures at 10,000 meters. Then it's quickly injected with superheated hydraulic fluid and given the command to start working.
As we were standing there listening to the actuator move left and right, it stopped. And it was not commanded to stop.
It just jammed. Stopped working completely. Take a look.
Systems investigator Greg Phillips now asks that the valve be taken apart and scanned for scratches. They find none.
Look at that. Doesn't leave a trace.
It's a crucial breakthrough to solving an almost perfect crime. Not only have they proven that the valve which controls the rudders can jam, no evidence is left behind. Tom Houter and his team have now found that a small hydraulic valve that controls the rudder of the world's most popular commercial jetliner can jam in the right circumstances. It's an ominous discovery, but incredibly, there's another shocking surprise in store for the investigators. October the 15th, 1996. For the last 5 years, the National Transportation Safety Board has been struggling to crack its toughest case. Two completely separate, but seemingly linked accidents. The crash of United 585 killed 25 passengers and crew. 3 years later, the US Air Flight 427 disaster took another 132 lives. Now, after examining hundreds of clues, investigators have made a surprising discovery. A new test has revealed that under the right circumstances, the hydraulic valve that moves the 737's rudder can jam.
It just jammed.
But the surprises aren't over.
The most important breakthrough came when a Boeing engineer, examining the data from that test, discovered some numbers that indicated the valve at that point had actually reversed.
Whoa.
It's a stunning revelation. Not only can the servo valve jam, but it can then function in reverse. It means that any time a pilot tries to correct a rollover by pushing on the rudder might turn in the opposite direction, causing a fatal accident.
And the reversal is like driving your car. You turn to the right, it goes left. You're not going to figure out this failure mode until you go off the road. And in these cases, that's the pilots were faced with, something so unusual that they didn't understand what was happening.
What the hell is this?
They had evidence now that the valve was unique, that the valve not only could jam, but would reverse.
427, emergency!
That would explain why the first officer, Chuck Emmett, would keep his foot on the rudder pedal, because he's thinking, why isn't the plane going right? And he's feeling the plane go to the left.
To the very end, Chuck Emmett pushes hard, hoping his rudder will help him pull out of his deadly spiral. Tragically, he has no way of knowing that he's steering the aircraft straight into the ground.
Ever driven to Colorado Springs and not gotten sick?
Flight attendants prepare for landing.
Satisfied that they've determined the cause of the crash of US Air 427, the NTSB turns its attention to the unsolved case of United 585.
Another 10-knot gain.
Going back to Colorado Springs, you could follow a progression of what the captain was doing. He's close to the ground, and suddenly, under rudder reversal, he puts in a little bit of pedal. The pedal violently pushes his leg back.
Oh, God! Slip!
15 flap!
15!
Rudder reversal certainly fits what I know about this crew and how it fits.
We were able to show the failure mode. It matched the flight data recorder from each aircraft. It fit like a glove. So we now had a lot more information we could apply to United 585. And based on that, we redid the accident report.
Oh, my God!
From rudder reversal to impact took less than 10 seconds. 585's flight crew had no chance to save their plane or passengers. In the aftermath of the investigation, sweeping changes were made to improve the safety of the 737 and the entire aviation industry. New training protocols were designed to help pilots react to unusual in-flight events. In the 737 fleet, pilots are now trained on how to react to both rudder hardovers and reversals.
The scenario of the US Air 427 accident, if the crew had the information that we have today, I believe they would have landed safely in Pittsburgh that evening.
The FAA also directed Boeing to redesign the rudder's dual servo valve to eliminate the potential for reversal. Boeing spent hundreds of millions of dollars to replace the valves on thousands of 737s around the world.
One thing we don't like at the safety board is to have an undetermined accident, because then we can't make a change to improve safety. So out of US Air 427, United 585, we have a much safer 737 fleet.
It took NTSB tin kickers 10 years to solve the mysterious crashes of flights 585 and 427, the longest investigation in aviation history.
There are still some people in aviation who don't think the NTSB got it right. But I became convinced after talking to many people, pilots, engineers, people at Boeing, and spending a lot of time with the investigators, that they did get it right.
Since the replacement of the 737 servo valves, there hasn't been a similar crash of the most popular, most profitable plane in the world. June the 24th, 1982. British Airways Flight 9 cruises through the sky over Indonesia. In a few hours, the plane and all 263 people on board are scheduled to land in Perth, Australia. Phyllis Welch and her daughter are seated in cabin E at the very back of the enormous jet.
How's that heroine of yours, Fanny Price, faring?
Oh, she's having a tough old time at Mansfield Park. It's a good place for me to spend a few hours.
Wouldn't mind being there myself.
It's all right, Mum, we'll get there.
We had already traversed at least 2 time zones. We were very tired. We had flown through Bombay, through Kuala Lumpur, hadn't been able to get much sleep, if any, and it was a dark, pitch black night.
Ahead of Betty and Phyllis, Charles Capewell is returning home to Perth, Australia, with his 2 boys, Chaz and Stephen.
Right, settle down, lads. Come on. It's time for a nap. Get back to your seat.
No.
What, do you want to sleep here? All right.
It was a good flight. It was going well. Leaving London, it was great. And we was all eager to go home, and the 2 boys were eager to get back to Mum. I thought, well, we'll be home in 3 hours, Perth. They'll be pat and we'll get in a taxi and we'll be home.
While many of the passengers have been traveling for almost a day, the crew is fresh. They took control at the last stopover in Kuala Lumpur. Captain Eric Moody got his first taste of flying at the age of 16 when he took a gliding lesson. He was one of the first ever trained on the 747.
Roger, check with Jakarta.
Jakarta Control, Speedbird 9 over Halim at level 370.
Speedbird 9, Roger.
First Officer Roger Greaves has been a co-pilot for more than 6 years. Barry Townley Freeman has been a flight engineer on these aircraft for just a little longer.
I'd not flown with Eric before, or Barry. That was the first time we'd actually met on that flight.
As the jet flies over the city of Jakarta, it's cruising at more than 11,000 meters and has been in the air for an hour and a half. Captain Moody checks his weather radar. It shows smooth sailing for the next 500 kilometers.
All right, Roger, it's all clear. Just keep your eyes open. I'll be back in a moment. Just got to use the loo.
Back in the cabin, many of the passengers have fallen asleep. While Charles Capewell and his sons doze, an ominous haze appears above their heads. It's still legal to smoke on passenger jets in 1982. For the cabin crew, though, the smoke seems thicker than normal.
Seems to be a lot of smoke out there.
They begin to worry that a small fire may be smoldering somewhere on the plane.
Maybe someone lit up in the toilet. Let's go see if we can find it.
A fire at 11,000 meters is a terrifying prospect. If there is a blaze somewhere, the crew must find it immediately. In the cockpit, the flight takes an unsettling turn.
Barry and I were just sitting there minding the shop. Pitch dark night, of course. And then we started to get these pinpricks of light on the windscreen.
St. Elmo's fire? I don't think so.
St. Elmo's fire is a natural phenomenon that's sometimes seen when planes fly through highly charged thunderclouds. But there aren't supposed to be any thunderclouds tonight.
Anything on the radar? No. No, it's clear. I don't like the look of this. Let's get a better look out there.
With the help of their landing lights, the two men are disturbed to see a thin layer of cloud surrounding their plane, even though nothing is showing up on their radar.
But at 37,000 feet, the normal thing you would anticipate would be high cirrus, which is just a thin layer of cloud.
I think we better get the captain back up here.
I was reading my book, and there was a slight flick of turbulence, just a slight flick, and I glanced over to the left, where I had a clear view of the port wing, and to my surprise, it was covered in a brilliant white, shimmering light, which seemed to be clinging to the wing of the aircraft. I carried on reading, but I found that I kept reading the same paragraph over and over again and not taking in a word of it. I just didn't know what was happening.
In the cabin, the smoke begins to thicken. Stewards have been unable to figure out where it's coming from. If there's a fire, they can't find it.
Eh? All right, well, go see that the passengers are comfortable.
Smell anything odd, Mum?
Seems rather smoky in here.
I noticed that thick smoke was pouring into the cabin through the vents above the windows. And that was a very sobering sight.
Turkish cigarettes.
It smelt like sort of a sulfuric electrical smell. And I went on that flight deck expecting to hear that we had some electrical smoke somewhere on the aircraft. But nothing was further from the truth.
When did it start? Or just after you stepped out? Anything on radar?
No, it's clear, not a cloud. Oh my lord, look at engine 4! It's lit up somehow. Captain, have a look at number 1.
It's the same on my side.
None of the crew have ever seen anything like this before, but the light show is just the beginning. Their bizarre flight is about to take a terrifying turn for the worse. Strange lights are striking the windshield of a British Airways passenger jet heading to Perth, Australia. At the same time, the plane's engines are lit by a brilliant white glow.
Look at engine 4! It's lit up somehow.
This light show, if you like, had become more intense. In fact, we ended up sitting there with 2 sheets of brilliant white light in front of us in place of the windscreens.
Inside the cabin, smoke has been growing thicker. Chief Steward Graham Skinner has been organising an intense but quiet search for fire.
What's with all the smoke?
There was smoke in the cabin. It got really, really hot. You were perspiring, literally drenched in perspiration. The acrid smoke was at the back of your throat, up your nose, in your eyes, and you were rubbing this and your eyes were running, and it was, it's not a very nice situation at all.
Flight engineer Barry Townley Freeman has been checking his instruments carefully. He's smelled the smoke, but so far has no indication that there's a fire in any of the plane's systems.
Can't find anything.
With one mystery confronting them, they're suddenly faced with a frightening new situation.
Dad! The engine's on fire!
The whole of the wing was a sheet of light. And I thought, wow. I said, oh, you better close that because we don't know what's that.
Cheers. Sit down.
Where are they going?
Stephen, close the blind.
Then I realised that, something was dramatically wrong.
There were huge flames coming out of the back of the engines, 20, some people said 40 feet long. These huge jets of sheer flame shooting out of the back of all the engines. Is it going to penetrate from the outside of the aircraft? Is it going to come into the cabin? Are we going to burn to death? Are we going to choke to death on the smoke? What's going to happen? What's causing it? What are they going to do about it?
As fire engulfs the engines, one of them revs loudly and flames out.
Engine failure, number 4.
Fire action, number 4.
Checklist, power and gear.
Set.
Thrust lever.
Closed.
Start lever.
Off.
Once one engine fails, you call for the drill to shut that one down. You have drills for certain things so that you don't fly together as a crew forever. You can fly with different people then, and you can standardise the operations.
The instruments do not indicate a fire on the plane, but the passengers can see flames erupting from the engines and stretching down the length of the 747.
I could not see the engines from where I was sitting. I could only see the space behind them. But there was enough glow in that space to convince me that the aircraft was really seriously on fire.
We were in trouble. They knew, that, as long as they were, they knew we were in bad trouble. And they sort of just looked at me as if to say, well, What are we doing now, Dad?
If anything's gonna happen, I want to be close to you. Oh, please.
The cabin crew begins storing anything that's loose. They don't want dishes or bottles flying around the cabin if the plane begins to dive.
Don't worry, it's just friction.
If I was misleading them, then that was for a reason, because I didn't want to get as upset as I felt. I just couldn't believe it. And, you know, this is going through my mind, and yet I'm chatting to the passengers and chatting to the crew, saying, oh, yeah, nothing to worry about. Yeah, it's just a little hiccup, you know.
The 747 is more than 10 kilometers above the ocean. Its engines appear to be burning, and peculiar smoke continues to fill the cabin. And then, the unthinkable happens.
Number 2 engine's gone.
All right, then, begin the engine shutdown.
No, wait! We've all gone. All 4 engines have failed.
The other 3 just went out almost immediately, and that's when it begins to be a serious emergency.
Those engines made a grating, rumbling sound, almost like a cement mixer. And then, gradually, the noise just disappeared and they became silent.
A minute and a half, we've gone from 4 engines running normally to having none.
The 747 has plenty of fuel, yet somehow all 4 of the jet's engines have completely stopped working.
Roger, declare emergency.
Mayday, 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 Speedbird 9. We have lost all 4 engines out of 370. Mayday, 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 Speedbird 9. We have lost all 4 engines.
With no engine power and no idea what has crippled their plane, British Airways Flight 9 begins falling from the sky.
Jakarta Control, Speedbird 9. We have lost all 4 engines, now out of 360.
First Officer Roger Greaves issues a mayday, but he has trouble getting his message across.
Jakarta Control, Speedbird 9. We have lost all 4 engines. Repeat, all 4 engines. Now descending through flight level 350.
Speedbird 9, you have lost number 4 engine?
This idiot doesn't understand. Jakarta Control, Speedbird 9. We have lost all 4 engines. Repeat, all 4 engines. Now descending through flight level 350.
The air traffic control at Jakarta, unfortunately, seemed to have a slight problem in understanding what we actually were saying.
Only when another plane nearby relays the mayday call do controllers in Jakarta understand.
Now descending through flight level 350.
Speedbird 9, all 4 engines out. Understood?
As far as the crew knows, no 747 had ever lost power to all of its engines before. The crew has to find out why it's happening now.
I think we've cocked something up.
We were concerned and worried that we'd done something wrong, you know, to cause the whole thing.
All 3 of us felt exactly the same, and it was a personal guilt in the sense of, what have I missed? What have I done wrong? You know, because, you know, this kind of thing doesn't happen.
While not built for gliding, even without its engines, a 747 can travel forward 15 kilometers for every kilometer it drops. With no power, Flight 9 has started a long, slow fall. Some 10 kilometers above the ocean, the crew has less than half an hour before they smash into the sea.
When they all stop, you go into automatic mode, obviously. We had practiced this drill on the simulator many, many times, and that's very good and all very well, as long as when it happens to you for real, what happens on the aeroplane is mirrored by what happens to you in the simulator, and I'm afraid that wasn't so.
In the simulator, when all 4 engines stop, the autopilot turns off. But high above the Indian Ocean, Captain Moody sees that his autopilot is still on.
we were all three confused and concerned that what was happening to us wasn't what we'd been told would happen to us.
All right, begin restart drill.
In the heat of the situation, they have no time to figure out why the autopilot is still on.
On.
Anything? Anything?
No.
Again. All right then, from the top, battery.
Check. On.
Crossfeed valves.
Open.
Fire switch.
In.
The standard restart drill takes up to 3 minutes to complete. Plunging from the sky, the crew has fewer than 10 chances to get their engines going before they run out of time.
Never on. Come on.
Again, gentlemen.
All right, from the top, battery.
Check. On.
Crossfeed valves.
Open.
Fire switch.
In.
At 10,000 meters, Captain Eric Moody decides to turn the plane back toward the closest airport, Halim, just outside Jakarta. But even that is too far away if he can't get at least some of the engines going again.
Jakarta, Speedbird 9, turning left back to Halim, out of 300.
Speedbird 9, radar cannot see you. Squawk Alpha 7700.
Air traffic control asks them to transmit the emergency transponder signal.
Jakarta, Speedbird 9, we are already squawking 7700.
Now the crew is flying back to an airport that can't find them on radar. Without the constant rumble of the engines, the cabin is quiet. Some of the passengers feel the plane beginning to descend. But without communication from the cockpit, they can only guess.
The quietness was unbelievable, because it was sort of, the aeroplane was no engines, nothing, and it seemed to be eerie, you know, a bit surreal really, because like as if you was suspended in space or something. And all I could feel was this quietness and the whimpering from a few people that were really upset.
Some people were sitting quite rigidly, almost as if they hadn't noticed anything. At first it was sheer fear, and then after a while it turns to acceptance. You know you're going to die. We knew we were going to die.
What's going on? What's the problem?
It's just a technical fault. I've been through much worse, let me tell you. Everything will be fine.
I think if I'd have sat down and really thought of exactly what was happening, I don't think I would have ever got up again.
One steward came up to us and said, "Are you two ladies all right?" And yes, we said, "We're fine," which was an absolute lie, but that's how it was. It seemed absolutely vital not to panic.
Captain Moody can't restart the engines unless he can keep the plane flying between 250 and 270 knots. But the airspeed indicators aren't working.
Captain, I've got 320 knots on my side.
Well, I've got 270.
Well, bloody hell, that's a 50-knot difference.
I'll change the speed.
Falling from the sky with no engine power, the crew now have no idea how fast they're going. But to have the best chance to restart the engines, Captain Moody has to have the plane flying at the right speed.
So from that point onwards, Eric then varied the speed through just about 100-knot range, hoping that at some point or other, coincidental with us putting the fuel into the engines, that we would actually be at the right speed.
To change speeds, Captain Moody turns the autopilot off. Then he slowly pulls the nose of the jet up to slow it, and then pushes it down to increase his speed. The upsetting roller coaster movement adds to the panic felt in the cabin.
At one time, the aircraft developed a strange motion. It seemed to be climbing steeply and then diving down. That was the sensation we got. And a bucking action that was so violent that we felt it could break the aircraft up in the air.
Pressure warning, Captain. We're at 10,000.
Pressure warning? That's not supposed to do that.
And a warning horn went off. Now, this didn't ever happen on the simulator in this exercise, so it was a bit of a surprise to us.
As well as providing electrical power, the engines on a jumbo jet help keep the cabin pressurized.
With the engines not working, of course, the air wasn't being pumped in. So gradually the pressure was leaking away.
With all 4 engines gone, the pressurized air is rapidly seeping out. The thinning level of oxygen makes passengers gasp. The crew reach for their oxygen masks. But First Officer Greaves can't get his mask to work.
My oxygen mask, yeah, that was a problem I could have done without. It was stowed above my head, and when I pulled the oxygen mask down, the mask and the tube became separated.
The captain must make a difficult choice. If he continues to descend slowly, it will get increasingly difficult for First Officer Greaves to breathe.
I said, look, if we get down to 20,000 feet quickly, we can all take our oxygen masks off and we can talk and we're back as a crew again.
We had to actually increase the rate of descent to descend to a lower altitude quicker, which in the circumstances was something that we wouldn't really have chosen to do.
So then I dived the aeroplane and got rid of about 6,000 feet in a minute.
The loss of cabin pressure and the steep dive have another terrifying consequence.
The things shot down, they sort of dangled down in front of you. And I looked to see if Stephen had got his, and Chaz had pulled his out of the socket. So I made sure that Chaz got his oxygen. I've seen a few movies on planes, and you know, once that happens, you know you're in serious trouble.
Tommy, here we go. Breathe normally, Mum, not deep. Breathe calmly.
The oxygen masks came down, and we put those to our faces as had been described in the drill, which fortunately we had been observing at the beginning of the flight. But it seemed that the oxygen supply was not working.
The cabin crew try to use the public address system to explain what's going on, but it's not working. Chief Steward Graham Skinner makes do with a low-tech backup.
Can you hear me? We're having a small problem with the public address system. So if you would, place your masks over your mouth and nose and breathe normally.
As the passengers struggle with their masks, Captain Eric Moody is running out of options. If his engines don't start soon, he'll have to turn his jet around and try landing on the open ocean. High above the Indian Ocean, the seemingly impossible has occurred. All 4 engines on a British Airways 747 have stopped working, and the crew has no idea why. First Officer Roger Greaves manages to fix his broken oxygen mask, but he's still frustrated by engines that won't start.
All right, Barry, let's start the restart drill. Ready? Set. Battery. Check. On. Standby power. On. Anything? Come on, anything. No. All right, then, let's do it from the top. Battery. Check. On.
First Officer Greaves and engineer Barry Townley Freeman have actually shortened the standard restart drill. It's giving them more chances to get the engines going, but so far nothing's working.
Come on, you old sod.
The process that we were going through the whole time was just continuous. We hadn't had any success with the drill at all, despite all the efforts we were putting in. But it was the only thing we had left to cling on to, so that's what we did.
From the top again. Battery. Check. On.
I have no idea, and I don't think any of us have, how many times we tried to restart those engines. If I say 20, I would think that's too low. If I say 50, I would think that's probably about right.
As the plane falls lower and lower, Captain Moody faces a brutal choice. A mountain range cuts across the island of Java between his plane and the airport. He knows he has to be at least 3,500 meters high to clear it. But if his engines don't restart soon, they won't make it. At this rate, it will crash in a matter of minutes. It's just a question of where. Captain Moody decides if the engines don't restart soon, He'll turn back towards the ocean and try landing on the water.
All right, are we getting something? It's not starting.
I knew it was so difficult to land aeroplanes on the sea, even when you had everything going for you. And I thought that, well, we haven't got much going for us here. I'd never done it before.
Hiding his concern, Captain Moody addresses the passengers and crew.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a small problem. All 4 engines have stopped. We're doing our damnedest to get it under control. I trust you are not in too much distress.
Most of the passengers expect the worst.
Ma, in trouble. Plane going down.
We'll do best for the boys. We love you. Sorry, Pa. I thought we were going down, heading for the ocean, which crash. And I thought if she got the note, you know, she knew we were still thinking about it. And we did whatever we could.
Will we be burnt alive? Will we be choked by the smoke? Will the aircraft break up in the air and hurtle us out into space, which was my biggest fear? Or will we come down in the sea and be eaten by sharks alive? Or will we crash into a mountain? Let's crash into a mountain quickly and get all this over.
Well? Nothing. It's not starting. All right, from the top then. Battery, check. On. Standby power. On.
Finally, Captain Moody has to decide. Carry on and likely crash into the mountains, or turn around and ditch into the sea.
I don't know how to swim.
I couldn't swim anyway, so I thought, well, you know, I'm doomed anyway. And I just hoped that maybe one of the passengers might help the 2 boys to make sure that they could stay afloat.
Well, anything? No. All right then, from the top again. Battery.
We had very few chances left of starting the engines before having to turn out to sea again, because we wouldn't have been able to clear the mountains on the south coast of Java.
Start level. Cut off. Fuel pressure. Available. Standby ignition on.
And then, as suddenly as it had stopped working, the 4th engine roars back to life.
Engine 4, back online.
Then all of a sudden there was this sort of like somebody giving the aeroplane a punch from underneath. And then I realised that it might have been an engine. It was boom.
Oh my God, look.
The noise that a Rolls-Royce engine makes when it starts up is low rumbling noise, you know, and it was just, well, it was wonderful to hear it.
A 747 can fly with 1 engine, but Captain Moody knows that just 1 engine still won't give him enough power to clear the mountains.
The glass now is half full, it's not half empty. We're now in with a real chance. And I tell you what, the 3 of us would have dragged that aeroplane around the whole island of Java.
As the plane falls past 4,000 meters, another engine coughs and comes back to life.
Engine 3, back online.
It's followed quickly by the final 2.
Do you believe it? Engines 1 and 2, both back online.
From almost certain disaster, the crippled jet is now under full power.
Oh my God,
I realised then that we could make it back to, not to Perth, but to an airport. That's all we wanted, was to land on the earth and you know, be part of the living again. Because while we were up there, we were dead.
Jakarta, Speedbird 9, we are back in business. All 4 running, all 4
This time, local controllers have no trouble understanding the message.
All 4 engines serviceable again. Confirm continuing to Hallie.
Affirmative, affirmative.
We say, right, let's get this thing on the ground as quickly as we can.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We seem to have overcome that problem and have managed to start all the engines. We are diverting to Jakarta and expect to land in about 15 minutes.
Captain Moody begins climbing, putting plenty of room between his plane and the mountains below. But as he does, the strange lights that he saw when the crisis began reappear in front of the jet.
Now, as soon as we got to 15,000 feet, this St. Elmo's fire started again. Now, I'm not slow, so I said, let's get out of here quickly.
But before he can descend very far, the plane is stricken again.
Engine 2 is surging.
The whole aeroplane was shaking. It was just going bang, bang, bang.
The atmosphere in the cabin was very tense and very quiet. By then, I think very few people were talking. I think there were quite a lot of prayers going up.
The engines backfire violently. The captain must make another fateful decision.
Begin shutdown drill.
Checklist powering gear. Off. Thrust lever.
Closed.
We were reluctant to do it, as you can probably understand, but, you know, that was it. So we were back on 3 engines.
Now, I'm not a coward, but when you've had 4 engines going, no engines going, you get 4 going and show me any pilot that will quickly shut down that engine, because you're worried that they're all going to stop again.
Jakarta, Speedbird 9, leaving 1:54:120. We are now on 3 engines.
As the plane closes in on the airport, First Officer Greaves thinks the windshield is covered in moisture, making it hard to see through.
And I said to Eric, yeah, it's a bit misty out there. So we turned the blowers on to kind of, like demisters on your car to try and clear that. That didn't work. I used the windscreen wipers, and that didn't work.
Somehow the glass itself has been badly damaged.
For some unknown reason, I looked out the edge of my windscreen, and about a 2-inch strip down the edge on the left-hand side, I could see much more clearly. But I couldn't see anything much out the front. It was getting more and more opaque the nearer and nearer we got to the lights.
The crew get a final unwelcome surprise. Equipment on the ground that helps them descend at the proper angle isn't working.
Jakarta ATC, be advised, our glide path is unserviceable.
The localizer, which gives you the left and right of the runway centerline, that was working, but the glide slope, which gives you the actual profile for the descent, was not working.
After all the troubles they've been through, now the crew has to land their plane manually.
We then continued with Eric flying the localizer and me calling out the distance and the altitude that he should be at.
300 feet, Captain.
So he was then able to adjust his rate of descent to what I was telling him as far as the glide slope was concerned.
200. 150 feet, Captain. 100. 50 feet. 30 feet.
We're on the runway!
Reverse.
$90 knots, 80 knots.
We're down. Could really go for a cold soda.
And the aeroplane just landed itself. It seemed to anyway. It kissed the earth. It was beautiful.
That's amazing.
Safely on the ground at Halim Airport in Jakarta, passengers celebrate the end of a harrowing ordeal. They also want to know what happened. No fire had been found, so why had smoke filled the cabin? How could all 4 engines have stopped at nearly the same time? What were the strange lights that surrounded the plane? In the cockpit, the flight crew are relieved, but also concerned that they might be at fault.
The first thing that we did, having parked the airplane and shut it all down, was to then go through all the paperwork to see if there was possibly anything anywhere in it that might have given us any pre-warning of some sort of phenomenon that caused what happened to us.
Every time, because it's going to come back to us.
The damage to the 747 is extensive. From the outside, the crew realize that their windshield had been deeply scratched. They see bare metal showing through where the paint has somehow been stripped away. And they still have no idea why any of it happened. When investigators uncover the cause of the disaster, Flight 9 changes pilot training around the world. During a calm flight to Australia, all 4 engines of a British Airways 747 suddenly stopped working. After a long, terrifying descent, the crew managed to restart the engines and land.
Wow, that's amazing.
They spent an excited and largely sleepless night in Jakarta before returning to Halim Airport to inspect their plane.
And we went back the next day to look at it in daylight. The aeroplane had lost its sheen, and in some places it had been sandblasted quite well, and all the decals and the paint had come off. It really was very little to see until they stripped the engines down.
The engines were manufactured by Rolls-Royce. Their investigation was led by a former engineer, Malcolm Grayburn.
3 of the engines were removed in Jakarta following the incident and were ferried back via cargo aircraft to London Heathrow and then transported to South Wales, where the engines were, in fact, stripped down into piece parts. And it was there that I got involved.
Grayburn was stunned by what he saw. Much of the engine was badly scratched and scored.
We did do a forensic analysis of the engines, and we did record it all in terms of photographic analysis, and also we did a lot of laboratory analysis.
Grayburn discovered the engines were choked with fine dust, pieces of rock and sand. When it was closely studied, they learned that the debris was clearly volcanic ash. Days after their harrowing flight, the passengers and crew learned that the night they were flying, there'd been a major eruption of the Mount Galunggung volcano, located just 160 kilometers southeast of Jakarta. Tom Casadevall is director of the US Geological Survey and has studied the Galunggung volcano.
Indonesia is the world's most volcanically active country. It has more than 130 historically active volcanoes, meaning volcanoes which have erupted in the last several thousand years. Galunggung erupted explosively early in the 1980s. In April, May, June of 1982, the eruptions became increasingly more powerful.
The eruptions were large and the damage was extensive. More than 60,000 people were evacuated from the area around the mountain. The night Flight 9 flew nearby, the volcano erupted again. As the ash cloud rose more than 15,000 meters into the night, winds pushed it to the southwest, right into the path of British Airways Flight 9. Never before had a volcanic cloud seriously affected an airplane. Could the ash really have crippled this flight?
Roger, declare emergency.
Mayday, 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 Speedbird 9. We have lost all 4 engines.
Unlike ash that you might see in a chimney or after a fire in a forest, this is not soft material at all. This is very fine, ground-up particles of solid rock and minerals. This material is very, very abrasive. It's very angular in shape. If you were to see it under a microscope, you would see very sharp angles. And so that's what caused the abrasion.
In addition to sandblasting the windshield and all the leading edges of the plane, could the ash cloud explain all the other strange phenomena the passengers and crew had experienced?
Remember, the aircraft is moving in close to 500 miles per hour as it's flying into that cloud. Even though it's a very fine material, it can still cause abrasion and friction on the skin of the aircraft. Because it's such a dry environment up there, that frictional electrification produces the glow that we refer to as St. Elmo's fire.
The electrification also caused the interference in communication experienced by the crew.
Speedbird 9, you have lost number 4 engine.
Some of the volcanic ash that was sucked in and ground up by the engines was also blown into the plane. And when passengers and crew saw it swirling through the cabin, they feared the worst.
You're a passenger, you're looking out the window, suddenly you start breathing this sulfur-laden air in the cabin, and it probably is a choking, probably a shocking sensation. It's essentially a house of horrors type situation.
While the volcanic ash caused the visible scarring, filled the plane with smoke and fouled communications, could it cause the engines to flame out as well?
An X-ray from front to back of the engine.
A turbofan jet engine works by sucking in enormous amounts of air. The air is then highly pressurized by the engine's compressor. This tightly packed air is mixed with fuel and ignited. The force of this reaction propels the jet through the sky.
The temperature in the combustion chamber where this ash was flowing through are around 2,000 degrees centigrade. And so the volcanic ash we know melts at about 1,300, 1,400 degrees.
But when the liquid ash reached deeper into the engine, it cooled slightly, turning into a sticky, molten goo. It attached itself to the engine and began choking it.
We got a fundamental disturbance of the airflow in the main core of the engine, which caused the engine to backfire, and the engines flamed out, and that was the cause of the problem.
Backfires occur when the engine isn't burning cleanly.
The engine's on fire!
There's too much fuel and not enough oxygen.
Engine failure, number 4. Fire action, number 4.
Checklist powering gear.
On Flight 9, the backfires were the cause of the enormous jets of flame many passengers saw behind the engines. After struggling against the choking effects of the ash cloud, the engines on board the 747 flamed out. What Grayburn found next was that a remarkable piece of chemistry saved the plane.
As soon as you came out of the volcanic ash, and the engines were not running, remember, so everything cooled down, it was enough for this stuff to break off and allow the engines to restart.
When enough of the molten ash was gone, the engines were clear again, and Townley Freeman's frantic efforts to restart them paid off.
Engine 4, back online.
We have learned quite a bit, and we've incorporated this learning into pilot training. Pilots now, for example, know what signs to look for when they might be in an ash cloud, and those signs include the odor of sulfur in the cabin, dust accumulating in the cabin, and if you're at night, you might look out and see the frictional electrification or the St. Elmo's fire on the leading edges of the aircraft.
Another important lesson learned from Flight 9 is that volcanic ash clouds do not appear on normal weather radar, which reflects water. Since the clouds are dry, they're all but invisible to radar. That knowledge has led to better communications between the geologists that study volcanoes and the international airlines that fly over them. The crew of Flight 9 was showered with awards and commendations in the months after their incredible night.
I thought the airmanship displayed by this crew during this event was absolutely fantastic. The way that they managed to guide this aircraft back down to a safe landing after having been through such extreme circumstances, it was fantastic the way they recovered this aircraft. Absolutely brilliant.
For everyone on board Flight 9, the terrifying plunge through the skies had a lasting impact. Betty Tutel was so struck by the events of that night that she wrote a book about the ordeal.
This was an event which was unique in aviation history, and it seemed to me absolutely vital that it should be put on record, and I wondered who was going to do this. But no sooner had that thought entered my mind than I thought, I'm going to do that.
Tutel would also end up marrying a man she met on the flight, James Ferguson. Charles Capewell and his 2 sons made it home 2 days after they touched down in Jakarta. 25 years later, both Chaz and Stephen still live in Perth.
Our time hadn't came and that was it. From then on, I took a different view of life. When your time comes, there's nothing you can do, but you can still hope. And we hoped, and we got out of it.
Not long after their fateful flight, Captain Eric Moody created the Galungung Gliding Club. Every member of the crew and all passengers were automatically admitted to this exclusive group. The survivors of British Airways Flight 9 happily stay in touch to this day. Gregorio Luperon International Airport in Puerto Plata, the Dominican Republic. February the 6th, 1996. The small Caribbean island is a popular winter getaway. A group of German tourists has been delayed. There are mechanical problems with the jet that was supposed to take them back to Frankfurt. The airline has arranged to lease another plane for the flight. The replacement jet is owned by Turkish charter company Birgeniar. They have a 757 that's been sitting on the tarmac for almost 3 weeks. But it takes several hours to get the plane ready to go and to get the Turkish crew aboard. By 10:15 p.m., the plane and most of its crew are at the gate. More than 4 hours after they were supposed to take off, the first of the passengers begin boarding the plane. They have a 9-hour flight to Frankfurt ahead of them.
Alpha Lima Whiskey 301.
Shortly after 11:30, Birgeniar Flight 301 is given permission to leave the gate. Moments later, it taxis to the threshold of the runway.
Cabin crew, take your seats, ready for takeoff. Cabin announcement is completed. Exterior
First
lights.
Officer Aykut Gergin is new to the 757 with fewer than 75 hours in the plane, all in the last 3 months.
Thank you. Ready for takeoff.
In contrast, Captain Ahmet Erdem is one of Birgeniar's most senior pilots. He's logged thousands of hours in this type of plane.
Alpha Lima Whiskey 301, ready for takeoff.
301, cleared for takeoff. Runway 08.
Cleared for takeoff. Runway 08, 301. Thank you.
A good flight. Good flight.
Good flight.
Mulis Evrenesolu is on this flight as a relief pilot. Like First Officer Gergin, he's been flying the 757 for less than 3 months. As the plane accelerates to takeoff speed, a light rain begins to fall.
Power set. Okay, check.
First Officer Ekut Gergin watches his airspeed indicator for a routine instrument check.
As the airplane's accelerating to takeoff speed, the first officer calls 80 knots.
80 knots. Check.
The captain, in theory, should verify that his airspeed indicator also reads 80 knots.
My airspeed indicator's not working.
The captain's airspeed should read the same as his first officer's.
120.
But the readings do not match.
Is yours working?
Yes, sir.
You tell me.
Erdem wants his first officer to tell him when the plane hits takeoff speed.
V1.
At 150 knots, the plane hits V1, the point of no return.
Rotate.
The captain must pull back on his column and get the plane in the air.
Positive climb, gear up.
Positive climb. Gear is up.
At 11:42, the plane takes off. Seconds later, Captain Erdem's airspeed indicator comes to life.
Is it possible to turn off the wipers?
Okay. Wipers off.
Climb thrust.
Climb thrust.
First Officer Gergin reduces power to the engines for a gradual climb to cruising altitude.
301, airborne 45, switch over Santo Domingo, 1243.
1243, bye-bye, sir.
Climbing through 2,500 feet,
Santo Domingo, good evening.
First Officer Gergin establishes contact with the island's main tower in Santo Domingo.
Alpha Lima Whiskey 301, climb and maintain 280.
Center autopilot on, please.
Center autopilot, as command.
Thank you.
1 minute and 30 seconds into the flight, the autopilot takes over. Onboard computers now make all the calculations and adjustments necessary to keep the plane climbing safely. Almost immediately, the computer reports a problem.
Rudder ratio, Mach airspeed trim.
2 different alerts warn the pilots that the plane is traveling far too fast. But the first officer's airspeed indicator shows the plane climbing at a normal speed, 220 knots.
Something's wrong here.
Unaware that there are any problems, the controller directs Birgeniar Flight 301 to continue climbing.
Alpha Lima Whiskey 301, report Pokek.
Okay, 280, I'll call you over Pokek. 301.
Okay, there's something crazy. Do you see it?
In the cockpit, the situation gets more confusing. The first officer's airspeed indicator shows that the plane is flying much too slowly.
Mine shows only 200 now, and decreasing, sir.
But the captain's gauge shows the plane flying far too fast, 325 knots.
Both of them are wrong. What can we do? Let's check the circuit breakers.
Yes, sir.
As the first warning is eliminated, a more persistent warning replaces it. The overspeed warning tells the crew that they are approaching 350 knots, the maximum speed at which the plane was designed to fly at this altitude.
Okay, it's no matter. Let's pull the airspeed. Let's see.
Resetting the circuit breakers turns off the alarm, but it doesn't fix the problem. Captain Erdem's airspeed indicator still shows he's flying much too fast.
Now it's 350, yes?
Confused by the conflicting information, Captain Erdem decides to do what the plane wants. He slows down.
Take that like this.
With terrifying results. The 757 is sending out warnings that are confusing the crew. Bewildered, the crew struggles to solve the problem. The lives of 189 people depend on them getting the answer right. Shortly after taking off from the Dominican Republic, Birgeniar Flight 301 is in trouble. The cockpit is filled with an ominous sound, the stick shaker alert.
A stick shaker warning is a warning of imminent stall. It means that the airplane is about to attain a speed so low that it cannot sustain flight.
The alert is so serious that it actually shakes the pilot's control columns. Combined with a loud rattling, it's impossible to ignore. To add to the crew's confusion, the plane begins to vibrate and dip wildly.
I'm sure every passenger on the airplane knew something was unusual because the aircraft started to shake in a very violent maneuver.
It's not the only problem the crew is facing.
ADI! The attitude deviation indicator is basically a round gauge that on this airplane is a screen, but it's blue on the top and brown on the bottom, and it shows not only the pitch of the airplane, but also roll.
On the gauge, blue represents sky. The more blue, the steeper the climb. Right now, it's showing that the plane's nose is pointing dangerously high. Then, more than 7,000 feet above the ocean, the plane rolls hard to the right and begins to plummet from the sky.
From the time that the stick shaker activates, it is now going to require proper action from the flight crew to sort this out, or they will end up losing control of it. The window of decisions is closing on them, for if they let it stall completely, maintaining control of the airplane will prove to be very difficult.
Captain Erdem struggles desperately to get his plane to climb.
Nose down.
He has just a few thousand feet to pull a 100-ton airliner out of a deadly stall. The less experienced pilots utter prayers and offer suggestions.
Thrust. ADI.
301, squawk 377.
Stand by.
Air traffic control is still unaware that Flight 301 is in grave danger.
The timing. What am I to do? You can level off. Our altitude's okay.
The plane is falling fast.
Okay, 5,000 feet.
Captain Erdem is trying to fly a plane that's become virtually uncontrollable.
Plus levers, plus!
Gergin pushes the throttles to full power, but it doesn't help. The plane spirals towards the sea.
Alpha Lima Whiskey 301, Santo Domingo, come in, please. Alpha Lima Whiskey 301, Santo Domingo. Come in, please.
Less than 5 minutes after takeoff, Birgeniar Flight 301 vanishes from radar.
Come in, please.
The Dominican Navy begins searching for the missing plane and its passengers.
En route, I was always thinking of what I would find. I thought I would find people screaming, people yelling, asking for help.
They discover something very different. The strong smell of jet fuel hangs over the water. Pieces of wreckage float on the waves.
I thought to myself, there was no one alive here. We didn't see any survivors, and we didn't see bodies. I really thought the plane had disintegrated on impact.
Within hours, more than just wreckage begins floating to the surface.
Around 5:20 in the morning, when the bodies started to come up, I did feel a great sorrow in my heart. I felt like I wasn't sure if I would have the strength to continue the work at that moment.
The search continues by the light of the next morning. American and Dominican rescue ships scour a 1,300 square kilometer area for survivors. None are found. Now it's up to the Dominican Republic's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau to find out what caused this accident.
We established a base camp at a hotel on the Cabareta beach, which is directly south of the accident site.
Over the next couple of days, investigators, reporters, and some of the victims' families arrive at the hotel. Nearby, evidence of the disaster reaches the Dominican shores. Wreckage and passengers' possessions are washing up on the beach. Even the smallest piece could be a valuable clue as to what caused the crash. The USA's National Transportation Safety Board agrees to assist the Dominicans with their investigation.
Welcome to Dominican Republic. I'm Manuel Sufon.
They send an investigator to Puerto Plata.
We could see that this was going to take some international cooperation to get to the bottom of the event.
Robert McIntosh will also provide support from the NTSB's Washington offices.
Any signal from the recorders?
This particular accident was the first major loss of a Boeing 757 in the water. There was added urgency because the aircraft was going into the livery of many American-operated airlines and on the market for the worldwide passenger service.
In order to understand what had happened here, we only had one key. That key was the black boxes.
Like all commercial airliners, the Boeing 757 carries a cockpit voice recorder that records all the sounds in the cockpit, and a flight data recorder that records a wealth of information about the plane's operation during flight.
We've got underwater locator beacons on these recorders. They work for 30 days upon immersion.
But the ocean where the plane crashed is over 7,200 feet deep.
We needed to locate them before the signals faded, and we also needed to remove them before the data was damaged by salt water. So we were in a race against time.
The NTSB enlists the help of the US Navy, who hire a submersible called the Curve.
CURVE stands for the Cabled Underwater Recovery Vehicle. It's a tethered vehicle. It has an umbilical, and it's controlled by an umbilical. It's not autonomous.
The Curve is essentially a remote-controlled submarine, which can work at depths no manned submarine could handle. While the Curve travels from the United States, Major Souffrant starts to examine the evidence he has. Radar on the ground tracked the plane as it climbed into the night sky.
I have the radar. The history of the flight is recorded here. So basically...
Investigators study the radar records, along with the conversation between the ground controllers and the crew.
I have the recording from the control tower.
Santo Domingo, good evening. Alpha Lima Whiskey 301, climbing with you.
Alpha Lima Whiskey 301, climb and maintain 280.
Okay, 280.
The exchange between the controller and Flight 301 is normal. The investigators detect no signs of trouble.
Last communication between them was only disrupted with a standby.
Espera un momento. 301, squawk 377.
Stand by.
As you heard, there's no reason why this plane went down.
What had caused something to go wrong to interrupt the flight path of the aircraft so rapidly? Certainly, it was a good question for us.
Any debris that's found is taken to a Dominican military base to be examined. Investigators comb through the wreckage they've recovered. Pieces of the cabin, life vests, even part of the landing gear have all been found. Every piece of debris is studied for signs of an explosion or fire. Investigators also check if any of the life vests are inflated. That would suggest passengers had some warning before the plane plowed into the sea. Cords on some of the life vests are hanging loose. But investigators conclude that could be the result of the plane's violent impact. The crash was so powerful, it has compressed coffee cans into flat pieces of tin. The wreckage tells investigators that the crash of Birgeniar Flight 301 was sudden and violent. But they find no evidence that there was an explosion on board. Major Souffrant looks into the possibility that the plane, which was called into service at the last minute, may not have been ready for the flight.
Manuel Souffrant.
Ah, hi.
I'd like to see some records of the Brigadier plane.
Oh, they're right here. This is it.
It had been on the ground for some time in Puerto Plata, and that became interesting to us. Why would an operating company have an aircraft sitting there?
Investigators discover that the plane wasn't on the ground for repairs. Based on maintenance records, the plane appears to have been mechanically sound. Birgeniar simply didn't have enough passengers to justify the flight financially. So they kept the plane and the crew in the Dominican Republic for almost 3 weeks. The plane's maintenance records turn out to be one more in a series of empty leads. The Curve arrives in Puerto Plata harbor. On February the 28th, more than 3 weeks after the crash, it slips below the waves, looking for the remains of the Birgeniar jet. It takes the robotic submarine 2 hours just to descend the 7,200 feet to the ocean floor. From there, it sends back images of the wreck of Flight 301.
The cockpit pretty much was sitting upright, and it was pretty much the nose of the plane, you know, and you could see the front part of it. It was obviously banged up and cracked and fragmented.
The clues investigators need to solve the mystery of this plane crash lie somewhere amongst the plane's twisted wreckage. The flight's black boxes are the top priority. The Curve quickly picks up the signal from a pinger on one of the units. Operators must now maneuver the sub towards the sound. They have to be able to see the boxes to pick them up with the robotic arm. It takes just 90 minutes to find the first black box.
The first one was sitting out in the open. Okay, it was where they could see it, and they picked the first box up. They grabbed a hold of it, and they just kind of tucked the arm up in place, you know, so that they wouldn't lose it.
The second black box is also heard, but after almost 2 hours, the Curve's cameras still can't see it.
You know, they knew it was right there, and they were searching around a debris pile, and they could not physically see it, you know, with the cameras of the vehicle. So as they went around a couple times, they started, you know, lifting metal up and moving pieces out of the way, and then they did find the second box under some debris.
Flight 301's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder are brought to the surface and loaded onto a waiting jet. Within hours, the black boxes are at the NTSB labs in Washington, D.C. Technicians prepare to extract the precious data from the boxes. Investigators hope it will tell them what happened aboard Birgeniar Flight 301. They'll soon uncover a stunning miscommunication between a seasoned pilot and his plane. To unravel the mystery of Birgeniar Flight 301, investigators are counting on the plane's black boxes.
That flight data recorder was our key. So the technicians got busy and gave us plots, visual plots of what was going on with engines and airspeeds and so on, to allow us to try and understand why that aircraft slowed down and then simply departed controlled flight and entered the ocean.
Ah, that's great. That shows us all we need to see for now. So it's all the flight data recording. It's on a timeline. Top is the pitch. We've got the airspeed and the altitude. But check out the timeline, 44.
Investigators immediately notice something unusual about the flight.
15 degrees pitch, nose up. Seems high.
It's almost the maximum.
And then it stays that way.
The plane began climbing normally.
Central autopilot on, please.
But investigators noticed that shortly after the autopilot was switched on, the plane's nose pitched upward. They also see that the plane's airspeed seems much higher than it should be.
350 knots. It can't be right.
Oh, there's definitely something wonky about the airspeed numbers.
This brought us to the question of perhaps we should be looking over on the other side at the cockpit voice recorder and see what kind of information was coming from there.
Can you cue that up and play it?
Investigators soon start filling in the missing pieces of the puzzle.
80 knots. My airspeed indicator is not working.
They learn that Captain Erdem noticed that his airspeed indicator wasn't working.
Fuel's working? Yes, sir. You tell me.
V1. Rotate.
But Erdem didn't think the problem was serious enough to abort his takeoff. The tape reveals that once they were airborne, the crew quickly became overwhelmed by a series of warnings.
Ratio, Mach airspeed trim. Something
to investigators, the captain seems to become increasingly bewildered by the messages he was getting from his plane.
Mine shows only 200 now, and decreasing, sir.
Both of them are wrong. What can we do?
Investigators don't know why the captain's airspeed indicator wasn't working. They do notice that the captain's gauge came back to life as the plane started to climb.
Okay, it's no matter. Let's pull the airspeed. Let's see.
It's a telling discovery, which leads investigators to focus their attention on the device that feeds the gauge's airspeed information. The pitot tube. A pitot tube is an airspeed sensor, a pipe open at one end that responds to air pressure. When the plane travels forward, an increase in air pressure inside the pitot tube causes the airspeed indicator's needle to move.
My airspeed indicator is not working.
But if a pitot tube becomes blocked, it can send faulty readings to the plane's gauges. Blocked pitot tubes have been a factor in previous plane crashes. In 1982, a Boeing 737 crashed in heavy snow in Washington, D.C. shortly after takeoff. The pitot tubes were blocked with ice. Investigators suspect that the pitot tube which fed the captain's airspeed indicator on the Birgeniar jet was somehow blocked. But they know ice can't have blocked the tubes of a plane taking off from a Caribbean island.
We don't know why it was blocked, but it presented a very, very interesting situation to us. We started carefully looking at what could cause that kind of thing to happen.
Senor!
Major Souffrant has a theory. He returns to question the airplane's mechanics.
Senor Souffrant.
We are done with these, thank you. I'd like to ask you some more question about the Birgeniar plane.
Souffrant suspects the mechanics may have taped over the pitot tubes during maintenance. It's a common procedure, but if the tape wasn't removed, it could have caused the deadly accident.
Maybe a piece of tape was left on accidentally?
No, sir. They didn't have to be taped. We never did anything with the pitos.
Did you put the pitot covers back on them when the maintenance was finished?
It didn't have any covers with it. We didn't take any off, and we didn't put any on.
And that's when we discovered that the pitos had not been covered for the 25 days that the aircraft remained parked at the international airport in Puerto Plata.
A pitot cover slips over the end of the tube. Regulations state that these covers must be installed anytime a plane will be on the ground for an extended period of time. A prominent flag is meant to remind pilots and technicians to remove them again before takeoff. Investigators find that the Birgeniar pitot tubes were never covered, and somehow the uncovered pitos had become blocked. Recovering the tube from the ocean floor is the only way for investigators to answer a pressing question. What blocked the pitot tubes?
Nobody knows for sure. The evidence is 7,000 feet down in the Atlantic Ocean.
But even if the pitot tubes were blocked, how could it have caused the crash of a modern jet and the death of 189 people?
It's not like your car where you have only one speedometer. In this kind of an aircraft, you have a total of 3 airspeed indicators, and there's a flight data computer which is computing the velocity in relation to the ground.
I'd like to welcome you all this afternoon. As you know, I'm Bob McIntosh.
Using information from the black boxes, the NTSB pieces together a real-time animation from liftoff to the final moments of Flight 301.
This is the indicator. The captain actually realized that his speed indicator was not working.
Is yours working? Yes, sir.
The big question for investigators is how could one faulty airspeed source result in a crash?
He realized it at a time when he could have aborted, he could have turned back, but he chose to continue. Right now,
investigators analyze the captain's every move and find that he allowed a small error to escalate and ultimately overwhelm him.
Rotate. Positive climb, gear up.
Moments after liftoff, Captain Erdem's airspeed indicator appears to be working.
And then that means it's at odds.
But investigators suspect the gauge is responding to changes in altitude.
Climb, thrust.
As the plane climbs through the thinning atmosphere, the air trapped inside the tube expands, causing a buildup of pressure. Inside the cockpit, this causes the airspeed indicator needle to deflect. Even though altitude is causing the increase in pressure, the sensors mistakenly read it as an increase in airspeed.
So at this point, the takeoff is standard, nothing.
Captain Erdem may have had 5 separate sources of airspeed to rely on, but investigators noticed that when the trouble started, he wasn't flying the plane.
Center autopilot on, please. Center autopilot has command. Thank you.
The autopilot was. And unless the crew reconfigures it, the autopilot gets its airspeed information from only one source.
Remember, the autopilot gets its data only from the captain's pitot tube, the one that was blocked.
The data shows that the trouble on Birgeniar Flight 301 began when the autopilot took over.
Right after the autopilot is engaged, the plane's nose begins to rise.
Investigators suspect that the crew didn't realize that the blocked pitot tube was feeding the autopilot faulty information. The computer registered that the plane was traveling too fast and raised the nose to slow it down.
It soon rises to 15 degrees, then it stays there.
Raising the nose works like an air brake. It slows the plane by creating drag. The autopilot is programmed to never bring the nose higher than about 15 degrees. Any higher, and the plane would slow down too much and stall.
The autopilot's a pretty smart guy. He already knows he's got all the power that he's going to get for the climb. The only thing for the autopilot to do is raise the nose. And it raised the nose of the airplane to its limits of authority.
But the autopilot was reacting to faulty information. Moments later, it sent out two different warnings.
Rudder ratio, Mach airspeed trim.
That the plane was traveling too fast to be controlled safely.
And the airplane begins picking up warnings, rudder ratio, a variety of things that the airplane is sensing problems.
Okay, there's something crazy here. Do you see it?
Yes, there is something crazy. Mine shows only 200 now, and decreasing, sir.
Both of them are wrong.
Investigators realized that Captain Erdem wrongly concluded that both airspeed indicators were malfunctioning. In fact, his first officer's gauge was always correct. The plane was traveling much too slowly.
What can we do?
Captain Erdem no longer knows which instruments to trust.
Let's check the circuit breakers.
As they saw these caution lights, they decided they were going to start pulling some circuit breakers. That would be rather strange.
The actions of trying to reset circuit breakers is something that pilots of older generations aircraft have learned via experience of sometimes being able to get an errant system back functional.
Resetting the circuit breakers turns off the alarm.
But that needle continued to climb around the clock face until it activated the overspeed warning.
The autopilot system sent yet another warning that the plane was traveling too fast. But the reality was just the opposite. The plane was slowing down.
At this point, the overspeed indicator is on. They're going slow, they think they're going too fast, and confusion has set in.
Let's pull the airspeed.
That's when Captain Erdem made the gravest error of all.
You can see that he now pulls back on his throttles.
Investigators realized that at the plane's already slow speed, pulling back on the throttles was disastrous. The crew got the most severe warning that a plane can send out.
And that's when he gets the stick shift.
He's got a tactile sense coming through his flight controls that literally shakes the stick and says, "You've got to lower this nose."
In a matter of seconds, Captain Erdem was first warned that his plane was traveling too fast, and then that it was traveling dangerously slowly.
They're in direct opposition of each other, and two warnings that you would never expect to get one right behind the other.
The autopilot is programmed to always disconnect when the stick shaker activates. It's up to the pilot to get the plane out of a stall.
Once the autopilot reached its limits of authority, it said, "I've done all I can do. I'm out of here."
When the autopilot disengaged, Captain Erdem suddenly found himself in control of the plane at the moment of his greatest confusion.
If you watch the plane at the top of the screen...
The cockpit recordings lead investigators to a stunning conclusion.
ADI!
Captain Erdem may not have recognized that his plane is about to stall, but the relief pilot behind him did.
ADI!
This additional pilot intervened to say, "ADI, ADI." In other words, look at that ADI and put yourself where you would normally see the nose of the aircraft. 5 degrees nose high, 10 degrees.
So when the reserve pilot says ADI, he is attempting to focus the captain's attention to roll and pitch, which are becoming problematic.
The relief pilot wanted Captain Erdem to recognize that the plane's nose was pitched dangerously skyward. Investigators can hear First Officer Gergen trying to convey the same message.
Nose down.
At this point, the first officer is actually trying to lead the captain to some solutions, but not actually take control of the airplane.
What the 757 desperately needed was airflow over the wings to generate lift. The only way to get that was to point the nose down and dive. What puzzles investigators is that the first officer had a control column identical to the captain's. He could have pushed it and brought the nose down himself. He may have been able to save the plane. But he didn't. Instead, he and the other Turkish crew member continued offering suggestions to their more experienced but overwhelmed captain.
But climbing, what am I to do?
You can level off. Our altitude's okay.
The recording shows that Captain Erdem ignored valuable advice that could have saved the plane.
And in the Birgeniar case, there's a case of a relatively junior first officer looking at one of the most senior captains on the airline. It is not culturally appropriate for him to say, I'm going to take the airplane away from you. Instead, he tries to assist the captain, to lead the captain, but leave the captain in command. Other cultures, other training, other airlines may very well have required the first officer to physically take control of the airplane.
I think the social atmosphere in the cockpit will prevail to revere age and experience to the point where it can kill somebody. And in this case, it looks like it did.
The flight data recorder reveals that instead of pushing the nose down, Captain Erdem tried to get more speed from his engines.
At this point, the crew goes to full power.
Thrust levers, thrust!
At the angle the plane was falling, the engines couldn't get enough air. Applying full power was more than they could handle. The left engine quit first. With the right side at full throttle, the airliner swings around as though its left wing were caught on a branch.
The airplane goes into a classic full stall where the nose drops, it falls on a wing, which is now a very life-threatening condition.
The 757 itself makes the situation worse. Like many modern jets, it uses a so-called swept wing design. The wings angle slightly backwards to reduce drag and increase fuel efficiency. But the design has a downside.
One of the characteristics of swept-wing jets is they get less and less stable. They're much harder to fly as they approach stall.
Sir, pull up! What's happening? What's happening?
To maintain control of a swept-wing jet with no more altitude than they had in this condition is very, very problematic, and they are not successful when the airplane goes into the water.
Investigators now know why Birgeniar Flight 301 crashed. What they can't understand is why the flight ever left the ground.
80 knots.
My airspeed indicator's not working.
At 80 knots, if the pilot and co-pilot's instruments disagree, takeoff should be aborted.
B1.
Investigators are troubled that the captain took off knowing he had malfunctioning instruments.
If something is not functioning correctly, it doesn't matter what it is, one should abort the takeoff at 80 knots.
This decision on the part of the captain has been criticized, but there is a very short time window for this decision to be made.
Members of the investigative team in Puerto Plata try to find any clues that might explain why Captain Erdem didn't abort his takeoff. It was raining that night. Perhaps he was worried that he wouldn't be able to stop his speeding plane in time.
Procedurally, he's required to stop, but high-speed aborted takeoffs are something that are very serious, and that flight crews train to avoid high-speed aborted takeoffs if possible.
And we certainly looked at the parameters of the runway to ensure that there was adequate runway in that particular situation.
Careful measurements are taken. Investigators conclude that at 80 knots, when he first noticed the problem, Captain Erdem had enough runway left to bring his plane to a stop. He could have aborted his takeoff. There's also the question of the hastily assembled crew. Investigators now wonder if the last-minute nature of the crew's call could have influenced their decision to take off.
Birgeniar started with a crew that probably didn't expect to fly that night. They didn't have adequate rest. They got out to the aircraft and perhaps were rushed in some of their planning.
Investigators consider the possibility that the crew, who had been away from home for more than 2 weeks, was simply too eager to get home.
08301, thank you. A good flight.
Good flight. Good flight.
This is the homesick factor. where minor problems are ignored in order to get back home.
Investigators will never know what was going through Captain Erdem's mind when he opted to continue his takeoff.
In this case, the airplane is accelerating rapidly enough. The first officer responds,
V1,
which is the commit to fly speed. And by training, now the decision window has closed. They need to fly.
rotate.
And immediately thereafter, they're airborne.
Once the plane was in the air, its blocked pitot tubes caused Captain Erdem to make a series of critical mistakes. But how were the tubes blocked in the first place? Investigators will find that the deaths of 189 people was caused by something the size of a paperclip. Investigators now know that a blocked pitot tube led to a series of conflicting warnings that confounded Flight 301's captain. Now they want to know how those same warnings would affect other pilots.
We went to a flight simulator, and in the simulator, we tried to recreate the conditions of what happened on the night of February 6, 1996.
Gentlemen, stand by.
The simulator showed investigators that an overspeed warning, followed by a stick shaker warning, caused even the most seasoned pilots to freeze. The contradictory warnings were potentially dangerous.
When the stick shaker activated, it was very unnerving. It's really overwhelming.
That would tell me that Mach airspeed warning horn combined with a stick shaker was a tremendously mind-boggling experience to a line pilot.
As a result, the FAA issues a directive that simulator training for all airline pilots must include a blocked pitot tube scenario.
The flight crew within Birgeniar was faced with a large number of warnings that kept coming, and each warning added complexity to the environment. There's a lot of warning lights going off. This captain is in a condition that is deteriorating now very rapidly. So there is a dramatically increased demand on the captain to fly the airplane.
The FAA asks Boeing to change some of those warnings. Those changes include the addition of a new warning, which tells both pilots that their instruments disagree, and the ability for pilots to more easily silence troublesome alarms. Finally, Boeing modifies its planes so that pilots can easily choose which pitot tube the autopilot is using for airspeed readings. All told, more than 1,400 Boeing planes worldwide are affected by the new directives. One final question remains. What had blocked the plane's pitot tubes? Investigators conduct an extensive search for Birgeniar Flight 301's pitot tubes. They are never found. But at Puerto Plata's airport, they don't have to look far to find the likeliest suspect. It's not ice, and it's not dirt.
We know that the area around Puerto Plata has a lot of bees and wasps and animals and birds and insects that like to build nests.
One of the insects is well known to pilots flying out of the Dominican Republic. It's called the mud dauber wasp. Bug experts tell investigators about an extraordinary connection between the wasps and a pitot tube.
Cuando la javipa albañilera está buscando un área para construir su nido.
When a mud dauber is looking for an area to build its nest, it's looking for a site, a place that's more or less tubular. When the mud daubers make their mud nest, the mud, when it dries, hardens and condenses. It gets hard.
Mud dauber wasps are squatters that make their nests in available places, like crevices in homes, or even the pitot tubes of planes.
La razón del que el avión estuviera tanto día parado.
That the plane was stopped for so long, 25 days, was enough time for any species of the mud dauber to build its nest in the pitot tubes.
Investigators can only conclude that mud dauber wasps blocked the uncovered pitot tubes that fed the captain's airspeed indicator, which caused it to malfunction.
They didn't put covers on the pitot tubes. So at some point in time, extended time, there was an opportunity to get something like a mud dauber in that pitot tube.
Investigators have their answer. On February the 6th, 1996, a tiny insect led to a series of mistakes that brought down an airplane and changed the design of the world's most successful series of airliners.